בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב, חנוכה שמח. It's a pleasure to see you all here on Hanukkah. And that's the second and the final shiur on our two-part series about Matityahu the Hasmonean, his biography and some of his Torah. And the main source we use is this book, Maccabees Aleph. That's the Hebrew version. On the screen, you can see the English version, and both of them are translations from the Greek. Now, the Greek itself is a translation from an ancient Hebrew source, which unfortunately, we no longer possess. So that's about the Sefer Maccabees. I hope today, time permits, also to see something from this book. This book is Kadmoniyut HaYehudim. I think it's translated as Antiquities by Josephus, Yosef ben Matityahu. And he is his own rendering of the story of the Hashmonaim. It seems that he is most heavily based on Maccabees Aleph, but as many times happen in other eras in world that he writes about, he is also using other sources that, again, didn't reach us. So we can enrich our understanding of the era by reading from Josephus. So I hope at least one section to read also from here. And I also hope to supplement our understanding with a few sources by Chazal, by the Rambam, and others. So that's our basic plan for today. It doesn't seem as much, but you'll see that it will take us. I would see myself as successful if we would be able to cover all of Matityahu's life and finish it as I wish today. So what are we speaking about? We are about 300 BC, more or less, the 300s. And in Eretz Israel, the sovereign, the governing government is the Seleucids. The Seleucids. So that's the word. I would try to use it from now on. So that's in Hebrew, you call him the Salvekim, the Seleucids. And they themselves, they are Syrians, but they are Hellenized to the highest degree, and they see themselves as a continuation of the empire that was established by Alexander the Great, Alexander from Macedonia. And they are in war against another Hellenistic empire based in Egypt, called the Ptolemy or the Talmai Empire. And in this war, Eretz Israel, as you can imagine, is just in the middle. And at a certain point, the Seleucids take control of Eretz Israel, and Antiochus IV decides that in order to have a better management of his empire, he wants everyone to Hellenize. So he's trying to force Hellenism, culture, and religion on the Jews sitting in Judea. Now, to be honest, the process of Hellenizing was already in full swing, not because it was forced, but because it was tempting. And especially the highest echelons of society were tempted and seduced into accepting these Hellenistic norms, culture, religion, and at a certain point, even the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, bought his position from Antiochus, and he himself was an Hellenizer, a very strong Hellenizer, and they built Gymantium and a different type of Hellenistic infrastructure in Jerusalem that were both idols, you could find their idols, and the worship of idols, and also there was a glorification of the human body, as was in the Greek culture, and as part of it, they would do their sport, the athletes would compete naked. That was part of what was considered civil. You know what? sometimes the wheel is just turning, and something was civil and then it was barbarous, and nowadays it seems that going naked in the street is considered civil and even the word progressive, but it's a sign of progress, right? Today. So who knows where are we going to go to with that? However, because they glorified the human body so much, they saw circumcision, they saw Brit Milah as an affront to the perfectness of human body. And so the Jewish athletes that would compete in these stadiums, they saw it fitting they had surgeries. I wouldn't go into the details because you are eating, but they had certain surgeries in order to fix the circumstance, the Brit Milah. That's the degree to which they were willing to accept the Hellenistic culture. Now, all of that happened even before Antiochus forced anything on the Jews, but it was not fast enough to his liking. So he tried to enforce everyone to become an Hellenizer. And he also looted the Beit HaMikdash, as was seen very nicely in the short movie that Frederica sent us. Thank you. So you can look at there in order to see even more historical background. At that point, many of the Jews that wanted to remain faithful to the Torah and to our tradition ran away from Jerusalem into the small villages all around. But again, Antiochus would not be pacified with nothing less than complete acceptance. So he began to send his officers into all of these small villages in order to force in every village an altar to be built and sacrifices to be made to Zeus and to the other Greek gods. And at a certain point, they come to, again, a small village named Modi'in. And in Modi'in lives the family of the Hasmonean, led by Matityahu, and they try to force him, as the most respectful man in the village, to make the sacrifice. And Matityahu not only refuses, but he also kills both the Greek, again, we call him a Greek. He was not a Greek. I mean, it would be very far fetched to believe that that was some Greek that somehow happened to be in Eretz Israel and was walking to Modi'in. That's not something that makes sense. He was almost certainly a Syrian. But he was an Hellenistic Syrian, as almost everyone at the time. So he killed the Goy, but he also kills a Jew that wanted to sacrifice on the altar. And after killing both of them, he made the cry, which we can translate as Mila Shem Elai. Everyone wants to follow God, come to me. And they begin to go and to arrange the revolt against the Greeks. In the beginning, it was very sporadic, as you can see, it's something that grew from the grassroots level. It was not something that was planned ahead. So in the beginning, there were just a group of people running from place to place, basically. And then they had, and that was the second important thing that we saw last week, they heard about a large group of Hasidim, meaning, again, people that were faithful to Hashem, and who ran to a cave in the desert in order not to be forced against the Torah. And the soldiers of the king found them and tried to force them to break the Shabbat. And after the Hasidim refused, then they waged war, meaning the soldiers waged war against the Hasidim on Shabbat. Because it was Shabbat, the Hasidim didn't fight back, even not took a rock to their head, because a rock is a muktzeh. The laws of muktzeh were already in place, so they didn't even take a rock to their hand, and as a consequence, they were all slaughtered, men, women, and children. When Matityahu heard about that, he made a decision. Let's read it now inside. So I'm in the second chapter of Maccabees, verse 39. You can see it on the screen. And Matityahu and his friends learned of this, and they mourned over them greatly, and they said, a man to his neighbor, if we all do as our brothers did, and do not fight against the nations for our lives and for our statues, now quickly they will annihilate us from the land. And they decided on that day, saying, every person who comes against us in battle on the day of the Shabbat, let us fight against them, and we will not all die as our brothers died in the hiding places. So that's the second. The first innovation was we're willing to kill even Jews, not only the Goyim, but even Jews were Hellenizer. There he used the story told in the Torah about Pinchas. So Pinchas killed Zimri ben Salu, who took a Moabite woman. And that was a precedent, right? That's the white word? Precedent. That was a precedent used by Matityahu to justify him killing the Jew on the altar in Modi'in. The second chidush, we may say, halachic novelty, here brought by the Hasmonean by Matityahu, is that you are allowed to fight back on Shabbat. As I said last week, obviously that was not something that was completely novel, something that was completely new. After all, Yoshua, we know, encircled Jericho for 7 days. If he encircled Jericho for 7 days, then for sure it was also on Shabbat. So they knew that you are allowed to wage war on Shabbat, and also practically speaking, if you cannot wage wars, any successful wars, if everyone knows that on Shabbat you stop fighting. Right? That would be the end very, very quick. So obviously they did fight on Shabbat. Why these Hasidim didn't fight back? So there can be different explanations, but it seems that their mindset was that you have two options, either to die or to break the Torah. They couldn't even bring themselves into thinking that taking a sword to your hand is a possible solution. Many of us can, I think, easily relate to the question, nasty question maybe, of why didn't the Jews fight back in the death camps of the Nazis or in other places? And of course, the simple answer is that it's very easy sitting here around the table, eating nicely and defended by Tzahal, to ask why the Jews there didn't fight back. But it's extremely difficult when you are in a position in which you are for hundreds of years or thousands of years, Jews didn't take a weapon into the hand. And then you bring them into a death camp, they are starved to death, and they are outnumbered, outgunned. And then you ask, why don't you fight back? And some of them did. No. And some of them did, which is even, I think, which is even, so that's something even more to mark and to say that some of them did fight back. But the masses that didn't fight back, we have to admit that many, and maybe the most, didn't fight back, but that's not a question. What is surprising is that some of them did find the courage and the ability to change their perception and fight back. But simply put, when your mentality is a mentality of someone that is being oppressed, it's very difficult to become and begin to think as an independent. Just think about the Israel in Mitzrayim. Another, I think, very good example. In order to take them out of Egypt, you needed someone that would be raised in the house of Paro. Right? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to arrange that Moshe Rabbeinu would grow up in the house of Paro, thinking and seeing himself as an independent man. So one day he would be able to take Am Yisrael out of Egypt. But for Am Yisrael, all they cared was about where would the next meal come from. Because when that is your mindset, it's extremely difficult to elevate yourself above the circumstances and begin to ask yourself, how do I forcefully extract myself from my situation? So that was the next chidush, we may say, of Matityahu. He said, we are not only faced with these two options of either die or succumb to the Hellenizers. We also have a third option, which is to fight back. And that's the great novelty, we may say, that Matityahu presents. At the time, and now I'm in 42. At that time, a gathering of Hasidians joined together with them, strong in power from Israel, every one of them volunteering for the law, mitnadev la Torah, for the law. Now, I want to take a few minutes to speak about what does it mean when we're speaking about Chassidians, Chassidim. Obviously, that it's so interesting because that's a Hebrew term that seemingly survived the translation to Greek and the translation to English. Chassidians, Chassidim. Now, obviously, we do not speak about the Chassidim from the 18th century. That's something that is much later, 2,000 years after. So who are the Hasidim who are speaking here about? I would ask us to be reminded, just a second, I will try also to change here. That. Here. No. I apologize, a few more seconds. Yes, very good. So that is Tehillim 149. And here we read the following. I would read the Hebrew and you can follow in the English if you like. Hallelujah, שירו להשם שיר חדש, תהילתו בקהל חסידים. Here then translate that as the faithful. But again, just see the words. So we speak about the singing of a new song in the congregation of Hasidim. ישמח ישראל בעושיו, בני ציון יגילו במלכם, let Israel rejoice in its maker, let the children of Zion exalt in their king, יעללו שמו ומחול, וטוף וכינור יזמרו לו. I skip a little. יעלזו חסידים בכבוד, so the Hasidim would again exalt in glory, ירננו על משכבותם, רוממות אל בגרונם, so they praise God in their throats, וחרב פיפיות בידם. These are the Hasidim. A two-edged swords in the hand. And that's not just a phrase, because he immediately continues. It's very literal. לעשות נקמה בגויים, תוכחות בלאומים, to impose retribution upon the nations, punishment upon the peoples, לאסור מלכיהם בזיקים ונכבדיהם בחבלי ברזל, binding their kings with shackles and their nobles with chains of iron, לעשות בהם משפט כתוב, executing the doom decreed against them, הדרו, and again, לכל חסידיו. So the Hasidim, in the original term, and this is from Tehillim, so that's from David HaMelech, and much before the Hashmonaim. So the term Hasidim meant people that are willing to fight for their faith. That is the term Hasidim. That's what it denotes. So when we speak here about Hasidim that were joining the Hashmonaim, we speak here again about people that were willing not only to die for their faith, which is obviously great Hasidut, but even more to kill for their faith, meaning to wage war for their faith. These are the Hasidim that we are speaking here about, which is, by the way, also sometimes used by Chazal in the same manner. The Talmud Yerushalmi tells us many centuries after the story of the Hashmonaim, we are being told about Yoshua ben Levi, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. So we're speaking about the 3rd century AD, so 500 years after the events of the Hashmonaim. And we are being told that the Romans once besieged a city, a Jewish city, and they demanded someone they saw as a rebel against them to be handed to them. And because he was a Rasha anyway, this guy, then Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi thought it is mutar, it is allowed to hand them this Jew, and by that save the rest of the city, because he's someone that should have been put to death anyway, even according to the Jewish law. So he saw it as not problematic to give him to the Romans to be killed in order to save the rest of the city. And after he did that, we are being told that before that, Eliyahu Hanavi would reveal himself every day to Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. But after he handed this guy, then Eliyahu stopped coming. And it took a few more weeks, and then Eliyahu came again. And Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi asked him, why didn't you come all of these days? He said, because you handed over this man. And Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, but I did as the law dictates. That's what I should have done. And says to him Eliyahu Hanavi, it may be a Mishnah, but it is not Mishnat Hasidim. Mishnat Hasidim. So what is the Mishnat Hasidim? You should have taken arms against the Romans. That's Mishnat Hasidim. Now again, not always it's feasible. Sometimes this attempt to be a Hasid, if it's being attempt in a situation in which it is unrealistic, it can cause destruction. So everything must have its time and place. However, this is the meaning of the term Hasidim, these people that gathered around Matityahu. I am going back to Sefer Hashmonaim. Okay, so I'm in 43. And all of the fugitives from the evils were added to them and became a support for them. That's very interesting. As a side note, it is, to me, it is clear that Antiochus shot himself in the leg, in the right by foot, shot himself in the foot by trying to enforce the Hellenization on the Jews. It was a process that to a degree was happening anyway. But because he tried to force people, that created a counter reaction. And so the people that Matityahu was able to gather around him were fugitives from the evils that understood now that they cannot just sit idle and protect themselves, they must fight actively back. And they assembled the force and struck down sinners in the wrath and lawless men in their anger. So again, we can see that the Hebrew again is you can feel it from the English. Who are they hitting back here? Who are they striking? I think it's very obvious. Mainly Jews. The sinners, the lawless men, these are not the Syrians. These are not the Greeks. These are the Jews that were Hellenizers. So he struck down sinners and the wrath and lawless men in their anger, and the rest fled to the nations to be saved. So the rest of the Hellenized Jews were either that they re-accepted Torah or they began to fled to the Syrians, meaning you had to choose. That's what happens many times in wars. You cannot stay in the middle ground where most of the people usually want to be. You have to choose. Either you go with the Hasmoneans and you are always Torah, or if you want to remain Hellenized, then you have to flee to the Syrians and to their camps. And Matityahu and his friends went around in the villages around Jerusalem and tore down the altars of the Avodah Zarah and circumcised by force all the uncircumcised boys they found within the borders of Israel. So that's very interesting. What does it mean when he says here that they forcefully circumcised the children? So Matityahu says that what he meant is that the Greeks put officers in the villages that their job was to make sure that there are no circumstances, there are no Brit Milah going on. Now, again, I don't want to think how they were making these checkups, but it's not so difficult to ensure that there would be no Brit Milah. And we remember, if you remember from last week, that there were extreme punishments of death, both to the baby and his family, for Brit Milah. So according to Yosef ben Matityahu, what Matityahu the Hasmonean was doing was to kill or to לגרש, to chase out, thank you, chase out the officers that were responsible for the prevention of the Brit Milah. That is according to Yosef ben Matityahu. However, from just the simple meaning here, it seems that they even circumcised by force babies that maybe their parents were reluctant to make the Brit Milah because they feared for the welfare of their children. Now that itself is an halacha that was later coded in the Rambam's Mishneh Torah. And again, I'm going to a different source. I'm sure there is an easiest way than to just stop it every time and re-begin it, but that's what I have. Okay, so this is from Sefaria. So you can see Mishneh Torah, Ilchot Mila, chapter 1, in halacha, in the second halacha. We may not circumcise a person's sons without his knowledge. So basically, circumcision should be done by the parents, which I guess makes sense to us all, unless he has transgressed and did not circumcise him. In such an instance, the court must circumcise the child against the father's will. So that's the halacha. Now, obviously, it is not being performed today because of the state of the law of the state, but that is the halacha. And if the matter does not become known to the court and they do not circumcise him, then when the child reaches bar mitzvah, he is obligated to circumcise himself. So that's the halacha. And Matityahu was performing it. What is the background of this halacha, which we may see as the third chidush? Right? The first chidush was to kill the Jews that are Hellenizing. The second chidush was to wage war on Shabbat. The third chidush is to do Brit Milah even by force. And by that, I think he reintroduced the arvut, meaning the responsibility of the Jews one towards the other. And that is, again, that's very similar to what we saw in the earlier chidushim, that he says we are not only sitting back and each one is taking care of his own, and if he's able to protect his faith, then good, and if not, then that's what it is. We are fighting back. Part of us fighting back is that we are making sure that as many Jews as we can are keeping Torah. There is no other way, he says. So that is part of the fighting back. Under normal circumstances, obviously, the parents would take care, as Baruch Hashem, the Jewish people did throughout all of Jewish history. But on such dire circumstances, Matityahu saw it as needed, as required, that the basic obligation and commitments of the Jewish people would be reaffirmed. And I think that's what had motivated him to take such an extreme step as forcibly circumcising the children. Returning back to Sefer Hashmonaean. I'm in 47. And they persecuted the children of insolence, and their mission was successful by their hand, and they reclaimed the law out of the hands of the nations. So the law, the Torah, was taken back. Now, it is not clear if the intention here is that there were real Sifrei Torah that were possessed by the Greeks, by the Syrians, and they reclaimed it, or does it mean that in a figurative, in a metaphorical sense, that the Torah, meaning the law of the land, was taken by the Syrians, and now they re-established the law of Torah? So they reclaimed the law out of the hands of the nations and out of the hands of the kings, and they gave no support to the sinner. And now the last, before the last scene here, another halacha that was stated by Matityahu, by Hashmonaim, but for some reason didn't make it into Sefer Hashmonaim, Sefer Maccabees, is recorded in the Talmud, in the Gemara. In Avodah Zarah, Lamed Vav, Amud Bet. You can see it here. Ki ata Rav Dimi Amar, so Rav Dimi came from Eretz Israel to Babylonia. He said, the court of the Hashmoneans, the creed, Beit Hashmonai Gazru, Israel Abba al Goya Chayav. So a Jew engaged in intercourse with a Gentile woman bears liability for transgressing 4 prohibitions. I wouldn't go now into the small print, into the fine details of what exactly is Chayav for. But the Gemara explains at length that before Matityahu Hashmonai, from the Torah, a Jew was not allowed to marry a non-Jew. But a random intercourse, while of course was not looked upon as something favorable in any way, it was not something that was punishable according to halacha. It was something that shouldn't be done, is inappropriate, unbefitting, every ugly word you want to use. However, it was not punishable. And what the Hashmonaim did, again, it seems in order to mark the differentiation between the Jews and the Gentiles, and basically the Hellenizers, they said every contact, a relationship contact with a non-Jew is asur completely and is punishable. And as you can see, punish in the hands of the Hashmoneans could be pretty extreme. So that's another chidush that we know of the Hashmonaim. And again, all of them seem to go in the same direction, which is we are declaring war. We are not just sitting back and waiting for things to happen, but we are proactively engaged in reclaiming Torah and reestablishing its laws. And now we go to the final scene, which is the death of Matityahu. Excuse me? Cliffhanger, yeah. No, but we have 20 minutes, Bezrat Hashem, to be fine. So, 49. And the days drew near for Matityahu to die. We can hear here the psukim from Yaakov, Vaikrevu Yemei Yisrael Lamut. So you see, it's all for me. I don't know. I know that I mention it every 5 minutes, but I'm fascinated by the way that you can see the Hebrew beneath this thick cloak of Greek and then English. So, and the days drew near for Matityahu to die, and he said to his sons, now arrogance and reproach have been established, a time of destruction and fierce wrath. So Matityahu dies, according to Josephus, Matityahu dies a year after the beginning of the rebellion. Still things are not smooth. They would not be smooth for decades to come. So he says to his children, it's time of arrogance and reproach, time of destruction of fears and fierce wrath. Now, children, be zealous in the law, be kanaim, and give your lives for the covenant of our fathers. Remember the works of our fathers which they did in their generations, and receive great glory and an everlasting name. Was not Abraham found faithful in temptation, and it was accounted to him as righteousness? Joseph, in the time of his affliction, and that's from Parshat Shavua, observed the commandment and became the Lord of Egypt. Pinchas, our father, they are Kohanim, Pinchas, our father, by becoming zealous with zeal, received the covenant of everlasting priesthood. So that's, again, a quotation from the Torah. It's Yoshua, by fulfilling the command, became a judge in Israel. Caleb, by bearing witness in the assembly, received an inheritance of the land. David, by his mercy, inherited the throne of kingdom forever. Eliyahu, by becoming greatly zealous for the law, was taken up into heaven. Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, because of their faith, were saved from the fire. And Daniel, by his simplicity, again, simplicity here means pureness, was rescued from the mouth of the lions. Now, it may be just seen as a list of proofs that it is rewarding to keep the Torah and to be zealot for its laws, because you see, all of these people achieved everlasting fame. And in a sense, that is what it is. For me, it's also reminding me in the end of Slichot. If you remember, we say, Anenu. מי שענה את אליהו בהר הכרמל הוא יעננו. מי שענה את דניאל בגובה האריות הוא יעננו. So that is a list in which, again, it can be seen as a list recording people that were asking God, besieging him for a redemption, and they received their request. So that's one way to see the list. The other one is, that's a connection. That's a way to reach out across generations and connect to our forefathers that also in times of great tests, they stood up and were successful in standing to these trials that they were tested at. So it's not only in order to strengthen me now in my faith in God, but as always, as Jews, we do never see ourselves in one generation, it's just us and Hashem in this current situation. It's always us and everyone that came before us and all the generations of the future we are now fighting in order to preserve. That's extremely important. It's, I may say to me, but it's not only to me, obviously, that's extremely important to the Jewish tradition. And I think that is what Matityahu is trying to establish in these last words. Now, I have here to put a word of warning, which I think I also mentioned last week, and that is, it is not clear to what extent this type of declarations put in the mouth of Matityahu just before his death, the author of Hashmonaim was there and recorded them? Maybe. And maybe it was recorded by someone that was there and was common knowledge, and he's just recording that for posterity, for future generations. Maybe. We can also be allowed, it's not Kitvei HaKodesh, it's not Tanakh. So we are also allowed to be a little suspicious and dubious. Maybe, just maybe, it's something that he made up. But even if it's something that he made up, for me, it's less of importance. What are the concrete facts? Maybe the only thing that Matityahu said is, please bring me the water. And then it can also, it's possible. It's possible. But it is clear that who wrote these words, and we are speaking about someone, it is accepted in the study of Maccabees Aleph that it was written by an eyewitness to the revolt of the Hasmonaean, someone that was in Eretz Israel during the revolt, almost certainly have met Matityahu and his sons. So that is someone that is very familiar with the heroes of the story. And he says that is what Matityahu would have liked to say. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, maybe it was something similar to what is written here. It's less of importance for me. That is the legacy of what is written here is more the legacy of Matityahu than what he in reality said on his deathbed. And again, maybe it is what he said on his deathbed, but even if not, it is not so important. That is what was recorded. And here he tries, as I said, to connect the situation of the Hashmonaim at the time, and the situation was very, 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 very unsafe and unsure. Again, we are looking back. We know that they won, but they were involved in a war against one of the greatest empires of the time. They were just a small place, Judea. And things were not necessarily going for the good. And he told them, we must fight for our faith. Now, our faith is not only our faith, my, Matityahu, Yos, Yehuda, and Shimon, and Yochanan, and Elazar, and Yonatan, but it's the faith of our forefathers. And we are waging war for it to be also the faith of our four-children. Oh, that's the word. The coming children. Therefore, keep in mind from generation to generation. You see, that's exactly what he's trying to emphasize here. That all who hope in him will not weaken. So that's a pasuk, right? That everyone that has tikva, ki kol dorshecha lo ייכשלו, ולא יקלמו לנצח כל החוסים בך. So that's exactly what he's saying here. Everyone who has faith in God, at the final end, would not be ashamed. It may be that in the short run, sometimes the faithful are being defeated. It does happen. Everyone who sees Jewish history knows that it can happen. But in the long run, the faithful would have their victory. I mean, again, we can speak about events that happened much, much after Matityahu. The Roman Empire ruled the earth and completely destroyed, annihilated Judea and destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. And the Jews were expelled to almost every place in the globe. But in the end, where the Romans are now, and where are we? We are back in our land, and the Roman Empire is something that is being led by historians. And their language is not spoken, Latin is not spoken. This was the Franca Lingua, this was the language of the world. No one speaks it today. I mean, some people, some students are being forced to learn it in university. I think even that is dying out. And our Hebrew, this small forgotten language, is very much alive. And our Sfarim, their greatest books, again, are only being learned in universities and in schools. But Jews are learning Mishnah and Talmud everywhere, all the time. So you can ask, who was victorious in the end? The great mighty empire or the small, seemingly forsaken nation? And the answer, for me at least, and I think for everyone, is clear. And that is exactly the type of spirit that Matityahu is instilling in his children and on as a reflection also in us celebrating Hanukkah. So do not fear on account of the words of a sinner, because their glory would become dung and worm. So I think I am a little more gentle maybe than Matityahu. Is more fierce. So he says their glory would become dung and worms. Today they are elevated, but tomorrow they will not be found, because they will have returned to their dust, and their cancers will be lost. Children, be brave and be strong in the law. That's similar to what we found in Yehoshua. רק חזק ואמץ. בכל דברי התורה הזאת, be strong in the law, be strong in the Torah, for by it you will be glorified. And now that was the spiritual legacy, and now it gives very specific directions. And look, Simon, Shimon, your brother, I know that he is a man of counsel. Hear him all the days. He shall be as a father to you. So Shimon, he makes the political leader. And Yehuda Maccabeus, that is a Maccabee, has been strong in power since his youth. He shall be the commander of the army. So Matityahu is giving the different positions in the revolt and shall fight the war of the people. You know that Yehuda is so accepted by historians as a great general to this day in West Point. I think it was in the movie. Again, I can only again recommend you seeing this extremely nice movie that Frederica sent to us in the group. Thank you again. And in it, they show in West Point in the American Academy for officers. So they have these statues of the different generals worldwide. And the representative of now the Jewish people made, we have great poets, we have great morals, we have great philosophers. We were not so great in wars. But we have one general there in these statues. I don't know how they made a statue of Yehuda Maccabee, from where did they take the face, but okay.
That's not true. We were great in the war.
You know what? I accept.
General.
I accept. We do not conquer the half of the world as part of the other people that are there. But we didn't never aspire to that. So, Yehuda Maccabee would be the commander of the army, and you shall draw to you all those who observe the law. So you should not just remain our own small family, but you should make the effort to draw all those who observe the law and execute vengeance for your people. Return what is due to the nations and be attentive to the ordinance of the law. And he blessed them and was joined to his fathers, and he died in 146th year and was buried among the tombs of his ancestors in Modi'in. They have some place called Kivrot HaMaccabim in Modi'in. It is very difficult to ascertain any historicity to that. Okay, it's interesting. And all Israel mourned for him with great mourning. Now, what I would like to do we have 10 minutes left. I would like to read again his last words, but now from Matityahu, seemingly had some additional source, or maybe that he made up a little more than what is in Sefer Maccabees. We have no way to know that. But in the last will of Matityahu, as recorded by Josephus, there is one addition which I think is extremely important to understand about what Matityahu was doing, even if he didn't say that, again, as I explained earlier, but it is reflecting and reflective of what his project was. So I am now turning our attention to the antiquities of the Jews. That's again from Sephaya. Just see how much do we have online. Everything completely for free. This is amazing. So that is, these are 2 volumes in the Hebrew. And here, that's from the online version, The Antiquities of the Jews. Now, again, that was written in Greek in the original. So the English is a translation, the Hebrew is a translation. If the Greek source does exist, if someone here knows Greek, then he can read it in Greek. But when he had ruled 1 year, we speak about Matityahu, obviously. When he had ruled 1 year and was fallen into a distemper, he called for his sons and set them round about him and said, "O my sons, I am going the way of all the earth, and I recommend to you my resolution and beseech you not to be negligent in keeping it, but to be mindful of the desires of him who begat you," meaning of Hashem, of mine, and brought you up, and to preserve the customs of your country, and to recover your ancient form of government. That is almost certainly by Josephus, because he was much more interested in the philosophy of the law. So recover your ancient form of government. It's very, very Roman in nature, this sentence. Which is the danger of being overturned, and not to be carried away with those that either by their own inclination or out of necessity betray it, but to become such sons that are worthy of me, to be above all. That's very, we would say, Polani. All right, so he says to them, I brought you up, I invested everything in you, don't make me be disappointed. That's basically what, according to Josephus, is saying. Yeah? And so not to be to become such sons as worthy of me, to be above all force and necessity, and so to dispose your souls as to be ready when it shall be necessary to die for your laws, as sensible of this, just by just reasoning that if God see you that you are so disposed, he will not overlook you, but will have a great value for your virtue, and will restore you to you again what you have lost, and will return to you that freedom which you shall live quietly. That is something that we do not find in Sefer Maccabees. But here it does being represented, and that is that Matityahu did not only fight for the ability to observe the laws of the Torah, but here it says also for freedom. And you will return to that your freedom in which you shall live quietly and enjoy your own customs. Your bodies are mortal and subject to fate, but they receive a sort of immortality by the remembrance of what actions they have done. And I would have you so in love with this immortality that you may pursue after glory, and that when you have undergone the greatest difficulties, you may not scruple for such things. To lose your lives. I exhort you especially, and that's what is most important maybe, I exhort you especially to agree one with another. So he knows that they are of different natures. Shimon is more politically inclined. Yehuda is more army declined. So that can be very easily be the as long as he was alive, he would give the final resolution. But now that they become a 5-man leading band, then the question is, how would they be able to agree together to one course of action? So he says to them, I exhort you especially to agree one with another, and in what excellency any one of you exceeds another, to yield to him so far and by that means to reap the advantage of everyone's own virtues. That's beautiful. He says, each one of you is special. So you would be able to perform the great task that lies ahead only if you'd be able to take advantage of each one special force. Do you then esteem Shimon as your father because he's a man of extraordinary prudence? I don't believe that was said because I think I already mentioned here once, there is no Hebrew equivalent to the word prudence in Hebrew. Just as there is no Hebrew translation to the word tact. We don't have that. So he didn't use the word prudence, I don't believe. What did he say? I guess as we saw earlier, that he has a very good political senses. Something like that. And be governed by him in what counsels he gives you. Take Maccabees, meaning Yehuda, for the general of your army, because of his courage and strength. And he will avenge your nation and will bring vengeance on your enemies. And meet among you the righteous and religious, and augment their power, meaning not only be yourself, but again, try to make a unity of Am Israel, those that are faithful to the Torah. So what Matityahu done was twofold. One goal, and that obviously was the main one for him, was the religious one. The Torah was being oppressed by the Greeks, by the Syrians, by the Hellenizers, and Matityahu wanted to push back and to allow room just for Torah observance in the most simple way. However, as you can see by Matityahu, and that's again, either that it was already there in Matityahu, what Josephus says here, or maybe that's a projection of something that only developed later. And that is that the aspiration for religious freedom also led the Hasmoneans to aspire for what we may call national freedom. So a few years later, and now I have to go very fast, Matityahu died, and Yehuda began to wage wars as the general against the armies of Antiochus. He had some very surprising victories in which he was able to fight and beat back much, much larger armies and much, much more well-trained armies than his. But he took advantage of the terrain that he was an expert of, and obviously the foreigner armies just didn't know the terrain that they were walking in. So he was able to take advantage of that. He took advantage of the surprise element because the armies that came in just thought that that's going to be a walk in the park. They didn't really expect the fierce opposition that Yehuda put to them. And after a few very successful wars, 3 years later, Yehuda was able to storm into the Mikdash. And as we know, in Cafe of Kislev, which was exact the same date in which Antiochus put the statue, the idol statue in Beit HaMikdash, so in Cafe Kislev, they rekindled the menorah and did Chanukah, meaning initiated the service in Beit HaMikdash, with of course, the famous nace, the miracle of the oil. And so that was 3 years later. Now, usually we end the story here. But the story didn't end so fast. Because the Greeks were able, in the end, again, I'm using the word the Greeks, the Seleucids, were able to assemble an army that beat Yehuda. Because Yehuda, after liberating the Beit HaMikdash, so basically the religious aspirations were fulfilled, and people wanted to return to their villages and to work their land and return to their families. And Yehuda was not able to assemble the army fast enough. They did it's difficult to speak about surprise attack when you speak about armies that go by foot and you know about them 2 weeks before. But also for you to mobilize your army, you cannot do it in a day or two. So when a very large force attacked Jerusalem, Yehuda only was able to manage about 800 soldiers, and they were defeated. Yehuda was killed, and everything seemed lost. Antiochus gave a proposal to Jonathan who became the leader of the army. So he gave him a proposal that all the religious freedom would be restored, and Judea would become again part of the Seleucid Empire just as a political subservient. But because, as I said, they understood that you cannot keep the religious freedoms without also having national freedom and self-government. So they declined this offer. And for more than a decade, Jonathan was sitting. They did not attempt to retake Jerusalem. They understood they need to build their force in a much more substantive way. So he built his force. He made contracts with other Jewish leaders, also with Rome, which was a rising power. And in the end, they were able, and here there is a whole sefer, right? So you need to read the whole thing. But they were able to beat back the Seleucids and to regain not only religious freedom, but also national freedom. And in our Hanukkah, we celebrate both. We celebrate the victory in the army sense, which is the national freedom, and we also celebrate the Nespach HaShemen, which we may see as the representative of the religious freedom. However, there were two dangers in what the Hashmoneans did that later came back to roost. That's the word. To bite them. It took a century or so, but there were two main problems. One is the Hashmoneans, as I mentioned during our learning, did not only fight the Goyim, the non-Jews. That was also really a civil war. And when civil war breaks, then you know where you begin. It's very difficult to end it. You can see in the United States, 200 years after the end of the Civil War, there are still strifes between the North and the South. It's very difficult to settle these things down. And the strifes continued inside the Jewish people. And also when you are allowing taking arms against your brother, even for a good reason, then this permission remains part of the culture. And you shouldn't be surprised if someone else who also thinks he has a very good reason why to take arms will do the same, even now you do not approve what he is doing. And what happened basically was that so that was one danger, which manifested itself, as we know, in the most extreme way in the destruction, in the Great Revolt against the Romans, in which no less than a great revolt against the Romans, it was a great civil war, a brothers' war within the Jewish people. Because each one, if the other was not just according to his liking in faith and in acts, then obviously, as our forefathers, the Hashmonaim, taught us, we need to be zealots, right? And they succeeded in being zealots. So that means that's the right way to go. And that was one of the main reasons for destruction, as Chazal teach us. And the second problem was that it is easier to fight Hellenism with a sword than to beat it culturally or philosophically. So what happened was that they won the war against the Hellenizers, but just a generation and a half later, the Hashmonean themselves, the house of Maccabee, they became Hellenizer themselves, which is hard for us to believe, but that's what happened. And Yanai HaMelech, which was, I think, a grandson of Matityahu that we've just learned about, he persecuted the Jewish sages because he saw it, because of political reasons, he saw it more befitting to befriend the Sadducees, which in themselves maybe had connections to Hellenism. So that means that you can never just say when the wheel of history turns and you are on top, don't just think that you'd remain on top forever. But you have to ask yourself, what is the next move of the wheel of history? And these problems of how we are to relate to external cultures in a way again, fighting with a sword is one thing, but it would creep. You throw it from the door, it would creep from the window. You need to shield yourself in the spiritual sense and to be able to deal and to understand in what they are wrong, in what they are correct, and then you don't have to fear them. So that was one lesson. Again, easy to say, very difficult to implement. We see it to this day. And the second was the danger of internal war. Both dangers, it's very difficult. It was very the Hashmonaim and the revolt and the success was on one hand the our ability maybe to fight well against these dangers, but on the other hand, that in itself was the harbinger of the coming of these dangers in the next generations. And for us, living in the next 2,000 years after, in the next Jewish sovereign state after the Hashmonaim, it is very important for us not only to rest on our successes, but to learn from the morals of our own people for their mistakes and to understand that it's not enough just to win a few wars and to declare a state and to live in it, but also we must keep the gift that we were given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and maybe that is the most important lesson that Hanukkah can teach us. So again, thank you so much for coming here on Hanukkah, and may we have a Hanukkah Sameach, and may HaKadosh Baruch Hu bestow us with miracles, as it was בימים ההם, also בזמן הזה.
1 second, I want to add I mean, if you, I'm sorry.
Yeah, for sure. I just, if it's fine, I'd stop the recording.
Did you record last week and this week the
Yeah.